About a year ago, I had a really nice conversation with my friend Baptiste for the Cross Pollination podcast about my research and all things metal. There's a link in the description if you want to check that out. We covered a lot of ground and he asked some really interesting questions. I also recommend all of the episodes of that podcast. He has a lot of really interesting conversations with a cool group of people involved with music in various ways, including other metal scholars. But one of my favorite questions that he asked me was about what metal ear training or musicianship training might look like. If you study music theory at the college level in the US, you're generally required to also enroll in an ear training course of some sort at the same time. This ear training, like most undergrad music theory stuff, is generally tailored to a subset of European music from the 17th to 19th centuries. A lot of it has to do with pitch, hearing intervals, hearing scales, hearing chords and inversions, etc. All this stuff is useful, but there are a lot of skills I've developed listening to metal that do not factor into traditional ear training sequences at all. In this video, I'm going to talk about just one of these skills. I plan to do some more videos on other ear training skills that are relevant to metal in the future. So if I were told to design a metal-specific ear training course, one major thread would be about getting comfortable with asymmetrical and changing meters. In the classical music that generally forms the core of a music theory/ear training syllabus, there are very few meter changes. In metal, there are a ton. For the rest of this video, I'll walk through a progression of difficulty for these, but I want to make clear quickly that I'm limiting my discussion of rhythmic difficulty in metal to this one type of thing on purpose. I know there's a ton of other interesting rhythmic stuff going on, but I think this is kind of the most basic level. The most basic level is to be able to recognize patterns and be comfortable with asymmetrical meters. What meter is this in? If you said 7/8, you're right. There are 7/8 notes in this recurring periodicity. The notes of the guitar riff and the entrance of the vocals, all that stuff changes, but the length of this pattern stays the same. Nothing I ever had to do in music theory or ear training classes would have prepared me for this. I learned about this type of thing on my own through a combination of listening, guitar tabs, private lessons, and watching other people's YouTube videos. Getting comfortable with unusual meters, by which I mean ones that aren't a default option in notation softwares, is the first step. The next step is being flexible enough to follow changing meters. This involves quickly interrupting the meter you've been hearing and shifting what you hear as a downbeat to deal with a new one. Here's a relatively easy example. We're shifting from a verse in 4/4 to a chorus-like section in 3/4. Not too tricky for metal, but this sort of thing is pretty rare in European music before the late 19th century, and it does require you to change how you're moving to the music. A lot of metal will change meters much more frequently. We have to keep changing our sense of meter from 3 to 4 to 3 to 5. This also isn't too difficult because we can keep the steady beat going through these meter changes. In other examples, we'll have to cut this steady beat in half in order to shift meters. Brad Osborn has a cool article about this. He would say that the change in this next example has an 8th note pivot pulse, because that's the biggest pulse that you can keep going through the change without having to reset. Here we go from 5/4, which we count in quarter notes, to
11/8,
which forces us to chop one of those quarter notes in half and reset our sense of the downbeat. We can keep going to smaller pivot pulses. 16th notes are even trickier. The grouping of 16th notes is constantly shifting and interrupts what might otherwise be a steady 8th note beat that we could feel. These 16th note pivot pulses become even more disorienting when they interrupt a steady quarter note beat, as they do in this next example. Here, we have to chop the quarter note beat implied by the drums not in half but into quarters and reset it by one of these very short values so that the repeat of the pattern lands on a downbeat again. So far I've given examples where we chop the beat in half or into quarters, so in 8th notes or 16th notes. The other thing that happens sometimes is that it gets cut into thirds. While 16th notes are a shorter pivot pulse than this, I think that this one, which is equivalent to an 8th note pivot pulse in a compound meter, is trickier because it's less common. In this example, we start with a steady beat with 3 subdivisions per beat. Let's call it 6/8. But at the end of one of these phrases, we get a measure of 4/8, meaning that the beat is delayed by 1/3 of its length, which is a really cool, subtle, slippery effect. I think that getting comfortable with these types of things, which means being able to identify them, transcribe them, and play them accurately, is a necessary foundation for all the more complicated rhythmic and metric stuff that happens in metal, like phasing, polymeter, and tempo modulation. Of course, this metric flexibility is useful in a lot of stuff outside of metal. If you're going to be playing Stravinsky or fusion, for example, you're going to need to be pretty comfortable with this stuff too. Anyways, thanks for watching. Please hit all those buttons on the way out and stay tuned for more videos about metal ear training. See ya.